I want to do something to illustrate something that may be surprising. I'm going to turn my terrain on, and I'm going to go down and kind of look closely at it, and I want you to think about what is missing. Probably sounds like a pretty dumb question, but here's a hint. What do we see here? Shadows cast by the pipes. What don't we see? Shadows cast by these volumetric clouds. So no, you do not get shadows from the volumetric clouds. I think at one point in CRYENGINE's history we did implement this, but obviously it's a very expensive thing to implement in a game, and it's pretty, but it doesn't necessarily enhance your gameplay. However, there's a cool workaround which I'll show you. What I want to use is a cloud texture to cast some fake shadows. So I'm going to go to my level settings. If you haven't turned this on in a while, don't forget that it's hidden under the level editor menu. And I want to go down to the section called Cloud Shadows. And I need to pick a texture. So I'm going to browse here and go into my textures folder, clouds, and something like this would work pretty well. You can kind of see what's going to be happening here. And I want them to move similarly to the way that the volumetric clouds are moving. However, these speeds, if I remember correctly, are really strong, or really fast. What we should see is cloud shadows appearing on the pipes, and there it goes. You see the sun disappearing behind a cloud, a 2D texture, but kind of simulating that thing. So you may want to tweak this speed. You also may want to play with the tiling. If you're seeing hard edges, you might want to shrink this cloud tiling down to soften the edges of the texture. The next thing we want to do is create some explosions. So the illusion that I'm going for is that when Flappy touches a star, it makes the star sort of explode in some way, shape, or form. And of course, then it'll disappear. I'm not going to get into creating particle effects from scratch. We're going to use them in the library. So we're going to go into our database tool, and we're going to go to the Particles tab. And we want to open something in the Particles library. So this is under the libs folder, libraries, particles, and we're going for something called explosions. And to use one of these is very simple. I'll try one of these. We have these folders here, and then this yellow thing is actually the particle effect. And there may be a few, or many components to this. It just depends on the designer of the particle effect. You don't have to break apart your particle effect into these separate components, but it's easier to organize and modify and trace things later if you take this approach. To use one of these, you simply drag it into the level. And I'm going to position this at the center point between the first pair of pipes. And if I right-click on this, I'm going to do it in the Level Explorer because it's too crowded with overlapping entities here. And I go to Events and say Spawn, I'll actually see the particle effect fire. So I'm going to change my angle a bit so you can get a better look at it. This is a pretty mild one. And there it is. The first thing I want to do here before I forget is to turn off this active property. Otherwise, as soon as I start the game, the particle effect is going to fire. And what I want to do is keep it inactive until the moment that the proximity trigger is touched, and then I'm going to actually activate it and spawn it. I'm going to go ahead and rename this thing first, Score Effect 1. Open up my flow graph here, and I'm going to go to my scoring section because that's where the proximity trigger entities are. And I'm actually going to add an entity node for this first particle effect. And I'm going to use this same event. When the proximity trigger is touched, I want to enable the particle effect, and I simultaneously want to spawn it. I also need to make sure that this is disabled on game start, that it isn't left enabled accidentally. So I'm going to be cautious and add this entity node again, and on game start, I'm going to make sure that this and all the other particle effects are disabled. I'm going to drag my score effect into the pipes folder, which is optional but recommended, and then drag it onto my master entity here, my pipe 1 bottom, and then test. And when I touch the star, I get an explosion. So now that I can see that that's working, I can do that 3 more times, and you can spend some time exploring the explosions particle effect database here and try some different ones. A lot of these are not going to be appropriate because they're just huge or they burn forever and that kind of thing. There's one thing you need to be aware of with regard to these explosions. Some of them have physical forces assigned to them, and that's not going to work for our game because it will push our player back out of the way from the force of the explosion. The designers of these game SDK particle effects have thoughtfully been quite clear when they are including some kind of physical force, because you're going to see a component here called wind something or other. I've gone through and disabled most of these. However, if you are getting this kind of blowback effect, go look for one of these components called wind and come down to the advanced section and look for force generation. If this is set to wind, that's your problem right there, and you simply disable it by setting it to none. Make sure that you save it, and then I can right-click on this and go ahead and assign it to the selected object. If I go ahead and test, it should work fine without any sort of physical force problem. So it'll take some time to experiment with those. The one other thing that we need to do in terms of our game is hide the star at the moment the player touches it. Select my star and add it as an entity. And as soon as the star is touched, I'm going to go ahead and hide that entity. I'm actually going to copy this node, and then in my pipe movement loop, for number 1, just as the pipe is beamed back to the start point, and I know it's off camera, I'm going to unhide. So I could go ahead and add 3 more particle effects of different types and repeat this same logic, but I want to introduce a concept that's really useful, and that's the idea of flow graph modules. So the idea here is if I have a flow graph that can be reused by multiple entities multiple times, rather than reproducing multiple copies of it, the way we did with our pipe movement graph, I can create one version of it and just feed it the entity IDs that need to be affected each time I call it. This is kind of similar to a function. A simple example of a function in real life, just to stay away from any kind of scary mathematics or programming, is I ask you a question, I give an address, and I say, who lives at that address? And your answer, your response is a name. So our function here is these 2 nodes, which says when a proximity trigger is touched, I want you to hide a specific star, and I want you to enable and fire off a particular particle effect. So I'm going to move these 2 nodes into a function, and then I can just call it and pass it the entity IDs of the score effect and the score star. I'm actually not going to end up with any less nodes doing it this way, but it's an easy to understand, simple example of how to create a flow graph module, as opposed to doing it for something like the pipe movement, which is incredibly complex with a lot of nodes. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those. And what I need to do is go here to FG modules and open up this one here. And from the flow graph menu, I'm going to go File, New FG module, and I'm just going to make this level specific. My game only has 1 level right now. And I'm going to call this Score Star. So it's in your level folder under flow graph modules. Doesn't really make sense to put it anywhere else. So it's going to create a blank flow graph except for these 2 nodes that you've never seen before, which says module to identify this as a modular flow graph, and then start and end. And by default, start is linked to success and cancel is linked to cancel. So we have these 2 outputs over here. This one I'm going to keep, but I'm going to get rid of this one and insert my actual logic between this start and the end. So I still have my 2 nodes on the clipboard, and I'm going to go ahead and paste them into here. However, I'm going to unassign the entity here because I'm going to need to create dynamic entity IDs that I can pass when I call the module. Now, to create inputs and outputs for a flow graph module, for our sort of function, we go to the Tools menu in flow graph and Edit Module Ports. You've been using ports all this time. Those are the inputs and outputs of your nodes. So I'm going to click on New Input here, and I'm going to call this ent star, and this is going to be an entity ID. And I'm going to create another one for the particle effect, which is ent particle effect. Again, going to be an entity ID, and click OK. I'm not going to have any outputs because there's nothing specific that I need to output other than, yes, I succeeded. So I can go ahead and click OK. And now you see that we've grown or customized our start node here, and it now has 2 inputs here. So I'm going to pass the entity ID of the star over to here. And when I call this function, what I want to do is hide the star because I've just touched my score trigger. And then, of course, I'm going to pass the entity ID of the particle effect over to here. And when this function is called, what I want to do is spawn it and enable it. And that's it for our function. It's very simple. One thing I want to clarify about flow graph modules, you don't necessarily need to tell it success. If you're not listening to this, if you're not reacting to it, it doesn't really matter whether you send a signal to this or not. If for some reason this was canceled, same kind of idea. If you plan on monitoring this in the other flow graph that calls this function, go ahead and map this through. But this is all optional. I hope this makes sense. So what happens next is there's a folder in the flow graph node section, which you've probably never looked at. And this module, which now sort of extends our flow graph, will appear under here, and it says call. So in order to actually fire off this function, we drag call score star onto the graph. It doesn't show up yet for the same reason that new flow graphs don't show up here. I have to manually refresh it. And the only way to do that in this case is actually to close my flow graph tool and then reopen it. And now if we go to the module folder, lo and behold, we see that we've now extended the functionality of our flow graph with this thing called call score star. So I'm going to go back to my main flow graph, back to my scoring section, and I'm going to drag my call score star onto here. And when I enter the proximity trigger, I want to call this thing, and now I need to pass it these two entity IDs. So I'm going to use an entity ID node, and I'm going to go ahead and assign the star to it, number 1, which I already have selected. Copy and paste another one, and then grab the score effect and assign that. And then I'm going to feed these entity IDs into my score star inputs. Let me just make this a little bit neater. And then the last thing I want to tell you about these flow graph modules is you're always going to have this entity as the first port. In this case, don't worry that it's red and unassigned. There's no entity ID needed other than these specific input ports that we've created. Okay, let's give this a test. There's our explosion and our star disappears. So repeat this same process, create 3 more particle effects, customize them, and here in your flow graph, you're going to call this function each time with the entity IDs of the specific stars and score effects. So I'll fast forward through this part of the video. At any point you can freeze frame it, or you also have the finished game and you can take a closer look at this flow graph if you get lost here. One thing that I forgot to mention, flow graph modules are completely independent files. When you save your level with Control-S, it does not save external flow graph modules. They're standalone XML files. So it's super important to get in the habit of going File, Save All External Graphs in your flow graph menu. I'm going to give this a test now that I have all my entities. And there I have a force, the problem that I was talking about earlier, and my score effect number 2. I'm going to retrieve the properties of that particular effect that I have, come down here, find this wind, and turn off this force generation. And go ahead and save it, assign it back to the entity, save and test. Here's my star number 1. Star number 2. Oh, and my particle effect doesn't seem to be firing or isn't very dramatic. So the only problem I have here is my score effect number 2 doesn't seem to have an effect on it. I'm going to go ahead and try and assign another one. And just double check that my wind is off. And you can see that my stars are spawning and being reused after each game loop. There's one subtle issue here which you might want to think about, which is we have these stars which are rotating. They're thin, but they're wide, and you may notice when I touch it, like in that case, the star isn't disappearing right away. It doesn't seem to be properly reacting at the right time when it makes contact with the star that's facing us. And that's simply because these proximity triggers are a lot more skinny than the stars. So if you like, you could come through and make those proximity triggers thicker on this x-axis. However, that's also not realistic when the star is facing us from the skinny angle like this. So unless you want to get into dynamically changing the width of the proximity triggers, you're going to have to compromise in some way. The last thing I want to do in this chapter is randomize the particle effects. It's the same idea of randomizing the pipe materials every time on game loop. Just to extend the illusion that there's an endless series of pipes, I'll randomize from a larger subset of particle effects more than just 4 that are static and repeated over and over again. So we can very much reuse the same flow graph that we already have. There's only one difference in the nodes. That's going to be our pipe movement flow graph. And we're going to take this randomized pipe material section, and I'm literally just going to copy the whole thing. Find another place for this, and then paste it up here. And the only thing that's going to change is obviously the paths and file names of the particle effects, and then these 2 nodes over here. Instead of an entity material change, I'm just going to use an entity property set. And I see I made a mistake here. I should have mapped to value, not to property. So the property that we want to set is the particle effect, and the value that we want to set is from this logic any. And the entity is going to be my particle effect. And now all you need to do is copy and paste the file names and paths of the 8 particle effects that you like from the database here into these set string nodes. So I'm going to the properties window. I have my particle effect selected. I'm just clicking in here. I'm going to copy this, double click in here, and paste it. So those are just 8 particle effects that I picked at random. Obviously, you'd want to test them and make sure that you like them. I'm going to copy this entire thing. And then all I need to do is assign the appropriate particle effect. Save and test. And you should notice pretty quickly that these are unpredictable now, these particle effects. I see that I have a problem with one of them, and I just need to edit it in the particle effect database. That's it for Chapter 10, the score stars. In Chapter 11, we'll add a major enhancement to our game and introduce audio.